Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to be singularly focused on one topic, which is the state of Russian-Armenian relationships, how it has changed over the last few weeks and months, and specifically the diplomatic goings-on between these two countries over the past week. It is fair to say that the war on September 13th, the Aliyev's invasion of Armenia, and the Russian response to it, or lack thereof, has entirely changed the political landscape of the region. And it's actually led to a great deterioration in the relations between Armenia and the Russian Federation. The turning point was the war, which frankly, in many ways, has politically transformed this area in a far more dramatic way than the war in 2020 that was launched by Aliyev and Erdogan against Artsakh and Armenia. And the primary heart of this matter is the lack of Russian reaction to the invasion of Armenia. This was obviously, they had treaty obligations that they were supposed to, any attack on proper Armenian territory was something that was supposed to be responded to by Sesto and Russia, and obviously that did not happen. And what this has done, it has in fact dramatically changed public opinion in Armenia. Public opinion in Armenia prior to September 13 can be divided into three categories. There was always a small slice of people that did not like Russia or hated Russia for different reasons, but they were always overwhelmed by a large number of people in the middle who didn't either love or hate the Russian Federation, but they felt that we had no choice but to have strong relationships with them. And they are part of the region. There's nothing we can do about it, and you're better off dealing with them in a positive manner than in a negative manner. And then there was another small slice of people who were distinctly pro-Russian, which in fact, in many ways, actually isn't pro-Russian. It's actually more about Soviet nostalgia among older people. So those were the three slices of Armenian opinion. And what's happened after September 13th is that the people who dislike Russia dislike it more. The people who were neutral have moved in a negative direction or dislike Russia. And the people who were actually pro-Russia have essentially gone silent. This was obviously followed up with this vacuum, this change in opinion, this change in positions was obviously noticed by the Americans. And they have very much stepped into the breach. And Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit here was the best example of that. Now that we've set up the context, let's move on to this week's happening. This is in regards to CSTO. CSTO dispatched its investigators to Armenia after the Aliyev's invasion to investigate, to see what happened, because apparently it's a great mystery. And what they said this week is that both sides should resolve this issue by negotiations, which is obviously an absurd position for a defense institution. This was responded to by many Armenian officials in a very critical manner, including the Prime Minister, the Speaker, and the foreign ministers. And the Prime Minister himself was the most pointed, saying if CSTO is not going to meet its treaty obligations, then let us know, so we can look for other partners. Now let's move on to the very interesting comments that President Putin made at the Valdai Club Summit, which is a yearly event, which is greatly followed by political observers inside and outside of Russia, during which the Russian president seemed to make a very distinct difference between the Russian proposals in regards to Artsakh specifically. And he said that the U.S. position is to force Armenia to hand over Artsakh to the Aliyev regime. This was immediately responded to by the U.S. State Department, saying that this is disinformation. Then President Putin went on to criticize past and I guess present Armenian leadership for not accepting formulas in the past, Russian recommended formulas that were more favorable, that would have had more favorable outcomes for Armenia than the current situation. And what we're actually seeing here is a bit of this back and forth between East and West, and specifically in regards to the Artsakh situation, is a bit of hostage taking, because ultimately the Russian presence in Artsakh is for the purposes of having direct influence on multiple countries, because the Russian presence in Artsakh makes them a player in Aliyev's country, in Artsakh itself, and in Armenia, because Armenia always has to worry about the fate of the people of Artsakh. However, this hostage taking actually goes both ways, because a Russia that walks out of Artsakh or allows Artsakh to be ethnically cleansed is essentially a Russia that is walking out of the entirety of the Caucasus, because that's a Russia that's not of any use for Armenia to begin with. So there's a bit of this game of chicken between these both sides, and the object here is to play it in such a balance that would give us the best possible outcomes. Now we're going to move on to this meeting that happened this weekend in the Russian city of Sochi between President Putin, Prime Minister Pashinyan, and the dictator from Baku. And let's go to the direct communique that was released right after the meeting, in which the parties agreed to solve all of these issues through a peaceful manner and not to use military force. And they should move on to mutual recognition of sovereignties and territorial integrity and the inviolability of borders. And the statement continued that both sides should work towards a conclusion of a peace treaty in order to achieve long-term peace in the region. Then the communique went on to praise the role of the Russian peacekeeper contingent, ensuring the security in the deployment zone. And this is key because it does not mention Artsakh, it just says deployment zone. And this was followed up by an interesting comment that the Prime Minister made 1 or 2 days ago in Parliament, in which he said that Armenia and Russia both agree that the final status issue of Artsakh is not something that can be resolved now. And it is something that should be pushed back into the future, because if you try to resolve it now, it will lead to further conflict and war, which is actually true. When you look at this in totality, what this is really about is for Russia to reinstate itself in the negotiations process and not to let this just be a Western thing. Now, these communiques that come out of it don't mean a lot, but what is interesting is this commonality of interests that you see for Armenia and Russia to have a Russian long-term presence in Artsakh, which is something that the Aliyev regime is trying to do all of its best to avoid. All of this brings us to a point of thinking clearly about where we stand. Where does Armenia stand with the Russian Federation? And I think we need to approach all of this without any emotionalism or actually personalization of politics. And we need to understand these things clearly. And there's multiple things. The first one is to understand that Russia can no longer be counted on as a guarantee of Armenia's security in any manner. And there are many here actually who believe that the September 13th attack were actually green-lighted by Russia. We obviously will have no confirmation of that, but many people believe that. The second part that we need to understand is that the alliance between the Russian Federation and the Erdogan and the Aliyev regime is actually very much intact and is very much a reality. And this will last as long as any combination of these leaders are there, or it could change in 5 minutes if one of them falls. However, as a matter of practicalities, that relationship exists. And this relationship is actually built on both on very specific geopolitical things and mostly on business financial interests, and sometimes, frankly, on very personal financial interests. We know that the lots, the yachts of all the Russian oligarchs are in Turkey and their planes are in Baku. So there's obviously a great congruence of interest there, and we know that the Baku regime is laundering oil and gas for the Russian Federation. So we need to understand that this alliance is there, and this alliance is in many ways pointed against us, and in some ways not. What is important for us, the third principle, is that we need to understand that we need to be free and act independently to secure our national security, for everything from weapons sales to training. We need to broaden our base far greater than Russia, and that is something, frankly, that is happening. The fourth thing for us to understand that it is true that the Russian Federation is actually a horrible ally in real terms. However, what history tells us that it's even a worst enemy. It can do us very little good, but it can do us a lot of harm. And our areas of vulnerability are dramatic, from our gas supply to our trade with the Russian Federation, which is depending on the year, one of the top 2 trading partners for Armenia. Whether it's travel, whether it's trade, whether it's tourism, there's many places where we are vulnerable if we ever have a completely adversarial relationship with them. And I will remind people that right now, economically, we have the highest growth rate in Europe, and we have some of the cheapest gas in Europe. And if you go to Europe, most of Western Europe, it's exactly the opposite. Most economies are in a recession, and people are paying for energy and resources, sometimes 10 to 20 times more than what we pay in this country. So our economic growth can ground down to halt if there's any kind of a direct confrontation with Russia on these matters. The other thing is, which is the fifth thing I was going to highlight, is every post-Soviet country outside of the Baltics that had a direct confrontation with Russia has come to a bad end, whether it's Georgia or Ukraine. Those things have not ended well. And obviously, the sixth one is our mutuality of interest in Artsakh. We can disagree on 1,000 different things, but at this point, at this juncture in history, we have a commonality of interest because the Russian presence there is the only guarantor of the physical safety of the people of Artsakh. So how do we conclude with this? What should be our general approach? And that is that independence, yes, we should have a much more independent foreign policy, looking towards the West, looking towards other partners, especially when it comes to assistance, when it comes to military training and purchases of weapons. But that should never put us in a direct confrontational, an overly confrontational position with the Russian Federation. In conclusion, what should be our red lines be with the Russian Federation? Outside of, obviously, the Artsakh issue that we just mentioned and the commonality interest, there's actually two things. One is that if they are not the guarantors of our security, which they clearly are not, they should have no veto power on who we deal with in actually getting ourselves into a place where we can defend this country on our own. They cannot veto our partners. And the second thing is that our democracy is not negotiable, that the political system that we have in this country is not negotiable. There's absolutely no constituencies in this country that want to turn this country into some form of Belarus with apricots. That is not in the cards. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
There lived a man in Russia long ago. He was big and strong, in his eyes a seeming glow. Most people looked with terror and with fear, but to Moscow chicks he was such a lovely dear. Rah, Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen, was a kid that really was gone. Rah, Rasputin, Russia's greatest love machine. It was a shame how he carried on. Rasputin, lover of the Russian